In the middle of the bustling city of Rome, there is a tiny patch of land, only a few dozen hectares wide, smaller than a single neighborhood in many big cities. Yet that place is the home of one of the most influential figures in the world, the Pope. The Vatican is both the center of the Catholic Church and an independent country, with its own flag, anthem, security forces, and diplomatic relations with hundreds of states. This raises a question. Why does Christianity, a religion that began with a small group of followers of Jesus in the Middle East, have a supreme leader sitting in Rome? Why did Rome, and not Jerusalem or some other place, become the center of Catholicism? What is the Vatican? And how did a tiny piece of land inside Italy turn into a separate country instead of just the grounds of a large church? In this video, we'll trace a journey that stretches nearly 2,000 years, from Christian communities persecuted in the Roman Empire to the image of the Bishop of Rome seen as the successor of St. Peter. From the time when the Pope was both a religious leader and a ruler over a vast territory in Italy, to the moment when the Papacy lost almost all its lands, and finally the Vatican was born as a tiny yet highly symbolic state. If you've heard the name the Vatican, seen the Pope on the news, but never really understood why there is an entire country just for the Pope, then the next part will help you piece together every fragment of that story. To understand why today there is someone called the Pope sitting in the Vatican, we first have to go back to the very early days of Christianity, when there were no cathedrals, no grand basilicas, and certainly no such thing as the Vatican State. In the first centuries, Christianity was just an emerging religion, born from the preaching of Jesus and his disciples within the Roman Empire. Believers had no church buildings of their own. They gathered in each other's houses to pray, share meals, and listen to letters from the apostles being read aloud. Each major city typically had a community, and that community had someone in charge. Over time, this role developed into the office of bishop, the person responsible for teaching, preserving the faith, and keeping the different groups of believers connected. At this point, there was no idea of a pope yet, only many bishops in many places: Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Rome. Catholic and Orthodox tradition holds that the Apostle Peter, regarded as the leader among Jesus' disciples, came to Rome, preached the gospel, and was martyred there under the Emperor Nero. Because of this, the bishop of the city of Rome came to be seen in the minds of many believers as the successor of St. Peter. However, in the first few centuries, the Bishop of Rome was not the king of all Christianity. He was one bishop among many, even if he was held in special esteem by many communities because of his link to Peter, because he lived in the heart of the Roman Empire, and because the Christian community in Rome soon became one of the largest and most influential. In other words, the foundations of the papal office did not begin with a throne, but with a community of believers and a bishop like other bishops, the difference being that he was in Rome and associated with the figure of St. Peter. The next question is, among so many bishops scattered across the Christian world, why did the Bishop of Rome gradually become the leading figure of Western Christianity, and from there evolve into the image of the Pope as we know him today? To understand that, we need to look at the special role of the city of Rome in both politics and religion at the time. That will be the story of the next part. Once we start talking about the Bishop of Rome, the next question almost asks itself. Among all the cities on the map of the Roman Empire, why Rome and not Jerusalem or somewhere else? First of all, in the ancient world, Rome was not just a big city. It was the very heart of the Roman Empire. It was where the emperor, the senate, and the army were based, the political, administrative, and symbolic center of power. The very fact that there was a large Christian community right in the imperial capital, gave that community a special weight. On top of that, Christian tradition holds that two extremely important figures, St. Peter and St. Paul, preached and were martyred in Rome. Peter is seen as the rock of the church, Paul as the great missionary, and both are closely linked to the shedding of martyrs' blood on Roman soil. This turned the city into a place of sacred significance, not just a political center. As the Roman Empire gradually split in two, the centers of power shifted. In the east, Constantinople, New Rome, became the capital of the eastern half of the empire. In the west, Rome weakened, with emperors and kings appearing and disappearing in turn. In that context, the Bishop of Rome increasingly became one of the few stable pillars in the West. While kings and dynasties rose and fell, the Bishop of Rome remained, continuing to shepherd the local community and becoming a spiritual anchor for many believers and even some secular rulers. For Western Christianity, these factors piled up on top of one another. Rome, the former capital of the Roman Empire, the tombs of Peter and Paul, a large, influential Christian community, a bishop who gradually grew used to standing in the middle of great historical changes. All of this led to Rome slowly being seen not just as one diocese among many, but as the central see of Western Christianity. Even so, at this stage, the Bishop of Rome was still not the Pope in the full sense we imagine today. There were still many debates, many limits, and complex relationships with other bishops and rulers. The next question, then, is this: how did the role of a respected bishop in Rome, head of a local community, evolve into the image of the Pope, the supreme leader of the Catholic Church, with a voice that reaches far beyond a single city? At first, the title Papa, Father, Pope, was not reserved only for the Bishop of Rome. Some other bishops could also be called by that name. But over time, in everyday usage and in the minds of believers, the word Papa gradually became closely associated with the Bishop of Rome, until it almost turned into an exclusive title for the head of the Catholic Church. The historical context of the time also helped push the Bishop of Rome into a new position. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many barbarian peoples, as the Romans called them, such as the Goths, the Lombards, poured in and occupied former imperial lands. The old power structures shook. There was no longer an emperor, and in many cases, the Bishop of Rome was the only person with enough authority to stand in the middle, able to speak both to the people of Rome and to foreign kings and generals. In that situation, the Bishop of Rome did not only handle liturgy and preaching, he also had to deal with famine relief, negotiations, and efforts to prevent the city from being completely destroyed. He became a mediator who was both religious and political, a stable point of reference in a time of chaos. Over time, that mediating role developed into something else, the power to grant legitimacy. A famous milestone came in the year 800, when the Bishop of Rome, by then commonly called the Pope, placed a crown on the head of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and proclaimed him the new Holy Roman Emperor in the West. That image sent a very clear message. It was not only kings who chose the Church, but the Church, through the Pope, also had the power to recognize and legitimize kings. From that point on, the Pope was no longer just the spiritual leader of believers, but a real power player on the medieval European political chessboard, able to support, pressure, or even confront kings and emperors. But to stay in that power game for long, prestige alone was not enough. The Pope gradually gained something very earthly as well, territory, and his own state, the Papal States, the forerunner of the Vatican story to come. So how did the Pope end up with lands, armies, and become a king in the full sense of the word? We've seen how the Pope was not only a spiritual leader, but also a giver of crowns, with a real say in who rose and fell among Europe's rulers. But to truly stand on an equal footing with kings, spiritual prestige alone was not enough. Little by little, the Pope gained something very earthly, his own territory and his own state. From the time of the Frankish kings, especially King Pepin, an important turning point took place. Pepin wanted the Pope to recognize his legitimacy as king. In return, he granted the Pope a large stretch of land in central Italy. Over time, these lands gradually formed what became known as the Papal States. Put simply, for many centuries in the Middle Ages, the Pope was not only the religious head of the Catholic Church, but also a real secular ruler, directly governing land, cities, and people, with soldiers, taxes, and laws, just like any other monarch. This made the Pope's position both stronger and more complicated, because once he had land and temporal power, the Pope stepped directly into Europe's power struggles. For centuries, the Papal States were at the center of conflict. Clashes with the German Emperor in the Holy Roman Empire, tensions with the King of France as both sides tried to control the Church, internal infighting among powerful Italian families, each trying to put their own man on the papal throne to control both religion and politics. Spiritual and worldly power became so intertwined that many popes of this period were at once religious symbols and regional political bosses. Everything began to change when Europe entered the 19th century, the age of modern nation-states. On the Italian peninsula, the movement for Italian unification rose up, aiming to merge many separate territories into a single unified Italy. In that process, the Papal States were gradually annexed. In 1870, Italian troops captured Rome. From then on, most of the lands that had once belonged to the Pope became part of a united Italy. The Pope lost nearly all his territory, keeping only the Vatican and a few related areas, but the legal status of those places was still unclear. For many decades afterward, the Pope saw themselves as prisoners in the Vatican, refusing to recognize Italy's occupation and almost never leaving the tiny area around St. Peter's Basilica. At this point, a new question arose. If the Pope had lost nearly all his territory, in what capacity did the Vatican still exist? And how, from this tense standoff between the Papacy and the Italian state, did a fully recognized state of Vatican City eventually emerge as we know it today? After the Papal States were absorbed into a unified Italy, the story of papal power entered a very unusual phase. From being a ruler with a broad strip of territory in the middle of Italy, the Pope suddenly found himself almost completely landless. For many decades, at the end of the 19th century, the popes considered themselves prisoners in the Vatican. They refused to recognize Italy's seizure of Rome, hardly ever left the area around St. Peter's Basilica, and lived as if in a kind of political house arrest. On the Italian side, the government regarded Rome as the legitimate capital of the new nation, and the issue of the Pope demanding his lands back became a painful dilemma. If left unresolved, it would remain a constant source of tension, but giving the land back was almost impossible. This tug-of-war dragged on until 1929, when a landmark agreement was finally reached, the Lateran Treaty, signed between representatives of the Holy See and the Italian government. Under this treaty, Italy officially recognized the state of Vatican City as an independent, sovereign state, tiny, entirely enclosed within the city of Rome. In return, the Holy See, that is, the Pope and the central governing structures of the Church, gave up all claims to the rest of Italian territory and accepted a unified Italy with Rome as its capital. From that moment on, the Vatican was no longer just a church complex, but a sovereign state, even though its area is less than 0.5 square kilometers. It became the administrative and symbolic center of the Catholic Church worldwide, the Pope's residence, the seat of the Church's central offices, and the setting for its most important ceremonies. Having its own state, however small, gave the Pope and the Holy See a clear legal status in international relations. They can establish diplomatic ties, sign treaties, send and receive ambassadors, and participate in certain global forums not merely as a religious organization, but as a unique subject of international law. However, the Vatican's influence does not come from its size or its army, but from the fact that it is the nerve center of a community of believers spread across every continent. A single statement or gesture from the Pope can resonate with hundreds of millions of people. In other words, the Vatican is tidy on the map, but it functions as a kind of nerve center in terms of religion and symbolism. The remaining question is, in the 21st century, what role do the Pope and the Vatican actually play, and how should we look at them in a balanced way, neither idealizing them nor simplifying them? After walking through the journey from small early communities to the Bishop of Rome, the Papal States, and finally the birth of the Vatican, it's time to return to a very practical question. Today, what exactly are the Pope and the Vatican, and how can we look at them in a balanced way? First, let's be clear. The Pope, in religious terms, is simply the Bishop of the City of Rome, whom Catholic tradition regards as the successor of St. Peter. That is, the one who continues Peter's role of leadership over the community of believers. He is the head of the Catholic Church, not the king of all Christianity. Other Christian traditions, such as Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestantism, do not place themselves under papal authority and have their own systems of leadership and organization. As for the Vatican, in terms of international law, it is an extremely small independent state recognized after the Lateran Treaty of 1929, mainly to bring a definitive end to the dispute between the Holy See and the Italian state. It gives the Pope a clear legal identity on the diplomatic stage. He can sign treaties, establish relations with other countries, and take part in certain international forums not only as a religious leader, but as a unique subject of international law. However, the Vatican is not some secret superpower controlling everything from behind the scenes like in conspiracy movies. It does not have a mighty army, nor a huge economy, nor the ability to order other countries around. The influence of the Pope and the Vatican comes from something much softer, their role as a moral and spiritual voice for hundreds of millions of Catholics around the world. When the Pope speaks about war, poverty, refugees, the environment, it is a moral appeal, not a binding political command. Of course, throughout history, there have been periods when popes were deeply entangled in politics, sometimes abused, sometimes idealized. But if we look at the whole journey of nearly 2,000 years, we see that the Pope and the Vatican are not some supernatural mystery that fell from the sky, but the result of countless choices, conflicts, compromises, and adaptations between religion and politics, between sacred faith and earthly reality. Once we understand that background, we can look at the Pope and the Vatican more calmly, without turning everything into something untouchably holy, but also without rushing to believe overly simple conspiracy theories. If you enjoy this way of decoding religious symbols through a historical lens, then think about this. What would you like the next video to be about? The history of papal conclaves, how popes are elected, the origins of religious orders and monks in Catholicism, or the story of the Great East-West Schism, when Christianity split into Catholic and Orthodox branches. Leave a comment with the topic you're most curious about, so I know where to dig deeper in the next videos.